A summer evening greeted us as we arrived at the old house on the edge of the lake. The air was foggy and layered, as if steeped in memories. Through the trees, the final rays of the setting sun broke through, casting the water in shades of gold and copper. The place didn't seem quite like I remembered it. The houses lining this shore were all old, but this one, especially so. Its walls, hidden under peeling paint, seemed to know something they either couldn't or wouldn't tell us. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew damp, as though it were saturated with years of forgotten conversations and secrets. The old furniture stood frozen in the rooms, as if suspended in time, and the scent of mold and dampness lingered, barely masked by the faint aroma of smoke from the fireplace. I let my bag drop with a sense of relief, looking around, trying to find some trace of warmth in the place, but instead, an inexplicable chill wrapped around me as though I had stepped into another world. While my parents were unloading the car, I decided to explore the house. The attic had always called to me, a place brimming with uncharted secrets. My steps creaked along the old wooden floor, and I noticed how hard it was to breathe, as if the air here had never been fresh, always thick and still, laden with forgotten memories. When I climbed up to the attic, I felt immediately that something was off. Everything looked just as it had in my childhood: old boxes, torn scraps of newspapers, rare trinkets that seemed untouched. But one detail caught my eye: the window. It was slightly ajar, and the cushions on the old armchair beside it were disheveled, as if someone had recently sat there or hidden there. I stepped closer and noticed the view beyond the window, a shadowy part of the forest. Oddly, I felt as though something in those woods was unsettling me, as if it concealed not just trees, but something far more frightening. At that moment, I heard sounds. A whisper. It was faint, barely perceptible, as if someone were speaking from behind the wall, but the moment I tried to listen, it faded. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt my hands begin to tremble slightly. I stepped back, yet my gaze was drawn to that spot. The trees outside, the old armchair, and even the house itself. They all had a strange allure, but it was tinged with fear. While my parents unloaded the last bags, I wandered through the house, searching for something intriguing. Most of the rooms were familiar to me from childhood, but one door, always closed before, drew my attention. It led to a study. The room was dark and cramped, with a low ceiling and an old cabinet that no one had opened for ages. I'd always felt that something important lay behind that door, but until now, I'd never dared to enter. This time, I couldn't resist. I gently pushed the door and it creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust, so stale that I immediately felt uneasy. Dark wooden panels lined the walls, and the desk held various antique items: glass inkwells, unusual fountain pens, and stacks of yellowed books. But the strangest thing I noticed was an old photograph lying on the desk. I brought it closer to my face. It was a black and white photo taken many years ago. In it, I was a small child, about 5 years old, sitting on the lap of a man I couldn't immediately recognize. He had dark hair and sharp features with an inscrutable gaze. There was something unsettling about this image. I'd always thought I knew everyone who'd been close to my family, yet I didn't remember this man. It wasn't just strange, it felt like something much more significant. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the door. They were soft but distinct, and a wave of panic washed over me. I quickly slipped the photograph into my pocket and tried to rejoin the others, but Jake appeared in the doorway. "Did you find something?" he asked, squinting slightly. I couldn't tell him the truth, though my mind was racing. Jake was a friend of the family, but his gaze was always watchful, and his grim silence unsettling. He knew I wasn't supposed to see that photograph. His presence in this room felt almost inevitable, but at that moment, I couldn't grasp what he was hiding. "No, just old things," I replied, trying to dispel the tension. Jake didn't look away. His face grew more serious and he took a step forward, as if he knew something. "Sometimes it's better not to know the truth," he said softly, his voice low and almost impenetrable, as if the words were as much for himself as for me. He stood there in that old study, bearing a weight I couldn't understand. I felt the air in the room grow heavier. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't find a single word to say in response. His gaze, intense, secretive, made me doubt whether I should keep searching for answers. But I already knew the mystery of this house ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. In the evening, when my parents went to the kitchen, Jake and I decided it was the perfect time for a little investigation. The photograph wouldn't leave my mind, and his silent presence only heightened my unease. We both felt there was something significant hidden in this house, something that gnawed at us. "Let's go," Jake suggested, his eyes alight with an unusual intensity. He was always reserved, but tonight, something in him had shifted. "Don't you think there might be more here? Hidden rooms, maybe something left behind?" I nodded, though a sense of dread was building inside me. We explored the open rooms, but soon found ourselves in one of the older, neglected corners of the house. There were forgotten items here, old armchairs, books, and boxes that hadn't been touched. Unlike the rest of the house, this part held a strange, frozen silence, as if time itself had stopped. We approached a cabinet with peeling doors, and Jake, without a word, began to carefully open it. Inside, beneath layers of dust and ancient odds and ends, he found a wooden box that looked far older than anything around us. I crouched beside him as Jake cautiously lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of yellowed letters, all tied with frayed, dusty strings. I picked one up and carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, but with each line, more questions flooded my mind. "You shouldn't read those," Jake said, suddenly tense, just as he'd been when he saw the photograph. He had gone noticeably pale. "You're not ready for what's in there." I looked up at him, surprised by his words. He no longer seemed like the calm, self-assured person I'd always thought him to be. Now, his eyes held something strange, something hidden that frightened me. "Why? What's in them?" I asked, unable to hold back my curiosity. Jake pressed his lips together, brushing a damp lock of hair off his forehead. His gaze grew wild, as though he was wrestling with some deep fear. He was silent for several seconds before he finally said, "Sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past. You wouldn't understand, and it's not meant for you." I couldn't fathom what he was hiding, but I sensed these letters weren't just words on paper. They were fragments of a story that maybe I wasn't meant to understand. My thoughts were tangled, and the question, "What is Jake hiding?" echoed through my mind. I couldn't grasp what he was trying to protect, but I knew it was something important. His silence wasn't just a secret, it was something deeper, more than a personal mystery. The next morning, as the sun had yet to fully rise and the air was fresh and slightly cool, I suggested to Jake that we take a walk. I wanted, at least for a moment, to forget the strange events of the previous night. We headed into the forest to gather firewood, looking for something simple and familiar to distract ourselves. The forest was dense and dark, with towering trees that felt as old as the earth itself. It was profoundly quiet here. Even the sounds of our steps were swallowed by the moss and greenery. "It's always so quiet here," Jake noted as he walked beside me, his voice lacking its usual confidence. It unsettled me. I nodded, though something still gnawed at me. I noticed Jake casting frequent glances toward the abandoned chapel deeper in the woods. We both knew of its existence, but neither of us had ever paid much attention to it. Now, I felt it had become part of something larger, something beyond just a forgotten building. As we approached, we saw that the chapel was completely in ruins. Its walls had crumbled, windows shattered, and the structure itself looked as if it hadn't been seen by anyone in years. We stepped inside, and immediately the air felt different. It was cold, and despite the summer day, there was a wintry stillness lingering in the space. "I've never been here before," Jake said, looking around. "But once I met a woman who said this forest, it brings something inexplicable to people." I looked at him, hearing a weight in his voice as though he carried an old burden. He went on, avoiding my gaze. She said the forest sees everything that happens to people, that it holds their fears and their dreams, and that many who try to hide from something or seek answers come here. She was strange, yes, but I believed her. I felt something shift in the air as he spoke those words. The forest didn't feel like just a place we walked through, just trees and leaves. It was something much larger, something more than met the eye. Jake stopped and looked at me. His gaze was dark, as if he were wrestling with something within himself. I thought I could forget. But here, in this forest, everything feels different. I've always felt something more for you than just friendship, he said quietly, his words striking me like lightning. I froze. My heart began to beat faster, and suddenly this walk took on a completely different meaning. The forest, the chapel, his confession, they all melded into a moment that felt both real and unreal. Jake, I began, but I couldn't find the words. In that moment, I didn't know what to feel, what to think. He was a friend of my family, someone I had grown up with, but now he stood before me, and I saw him in a new light. He remained silent. In that moment, among the ancient trees and the ruined chapel, I realized that whatever bond had connected us could never be the same again. Night descended abruptly, enveloping everything around in a dark shroud that seemed to swallow sound and light. We returned to the house, but the tension lingered within me. Everything that had happened over the past 2 days, the photograph, the strange letters, Jake's confession, seemed to converge into a single moment that neither of us could fully grasp, yet we both felt with every fiber of our being. When everyone had fallen asleep, I stepped out onto the porch, hoping to calm my thoughts. Silently, I made my way down to the lake, and as my feet touched the cold ground, I felt the atmosphere shift. The lake, once a simple, beautiful place, now seemed like something much more. The quiet, endless water reflecting the night sky gave everything a majestic, almost magical quality. I didn't know how much time had passed before I sensed someone nearby. Turning my head, I saw Jake standing in the shadows of the trees, as if he, too, had felt this moment. I couldn't explain what connected us, but standing there beside him by the lake, I felt the air around us fill with something invisible yet palpable, as if the whole world had gone silent so we could understand each other. Jake took a step forward, his eyes dark, absorbed in some deep thought. We were silent, yet all the unspoken words hung between us like stars in the night sky. "I didn't know I could feel this," he finally said, his voice filled with a strange mix of weariness and relief. "In this place, this lake, I feel a connection, as if it holds something I'll never understand but will always seek." I didn't know what to say, because his words made me reflect on what truly mattered. We stood under the shadows of the trees, and it felt as though the night sky, full of stars, was listening to us like something alive, attuned to our hearts, to our silence. "Do you believe in fate?" Jake asked, his gaze fixed on the lake. I looked at him, trying to understand where he was leading. There was no lightness in his voice. Everything was steeped in the same deep, lingering melancholy that filled this moment. "Sometimes I do," I replied, my heart tightening. "But sometimes it feels like I'm the one trying to create my own fate." He tilted his head slightly, looking at me as though seeing me for the first time. Our eyes met, and it felt like an electric current passed between us. The silence of the night grew so intense it was almost hard to breathe. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "This lake, it keeps secrets. Secrets I don't want you to know, but I can't keep hiding it from myself." His words were unexpected, but I realized he was speaking not only of the past, but of what we both felt now. The secrets that had led us here and those that remained hidden. And perhaps the greatest secret was that we both, in this moment, recognized we were standing on the edge of something that could change us forever. Without saying a word, I stepped closer to him, and everything seemed to glow a little brighter, as if light from the night sky had touched our hearts. We stood side by side, and I felt his presence becoming a part of me. In that silence there was everything: an unspoken confession, a shared fear, a quiet desire. Neither of us spoke, but it was as though words were no longer necessary. The silence around us was almost unsettling. The lake seemed to swallow all sound, even our breaths felt too loud. The moment stretched endlessly, and I could feel the tension between us growing with each glance. This entire night, all these conversations, confessions, it all seemed like the prelude to something inevitable. We stood so close we could almost feel each other's breath. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it was important. With each passing second, it became harder to hold back the feelings rising within me like a tidal wave. My heart began to beat faster, and my hands trembled. Jake was tense, too, his gaze filled with turmoil, as if he didn't know what to do with whatever was building between us. We were on the edge of something, ready to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and then, as if the moment itself were pushing us, he leaned in. Before I had a chance to process what was happening, our lips met. The world around us seemed to stop. Everything, the lake, the trees, the night sky, disappeared. But as soon as the kiss ended, reality snapped back into place. We both pulled away abruptly, as if realizing we'd done something that couldn't just be brushed aside. I looked at him, and he seemed just as shocked as I was. His face flushed, and his eyes were filled with confusion and something like an apology. "This was a mistake," he said quietly, his voice unsteady. His words deepened the chaos swirling inside me. There was no trace of the usual calmness in his voice that was so much a part of him. But in his eyes, I saw something different. It wasn't regret. It was fear, as though he was afraid of what had just happened and didn't know how to handle it. I stood there silently, trying to make sense of what had just happened and how to react. My hands kept trembling and my heart hadn't slowed down. I wasn't sure what I felt: fear, excitement, or something deeper, something that defied words. "I shouldn't have done that," he said again, but I already knew it wasn't entirely true. He didn't really mean it, but he couldn't find another way to cope with what had happened between us. I couldn't respond right away. All I could do was stand there in the quiet of the night, feeling utterly lost. And in that moment I realized this wasn't just a kiss, it was the beginning of something that wouldn't end easily. The next morning, I woke with a heavy feeling in my chest. Sunlight barely filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room, but there was darkness in my heart. We both tried to act normal, but every movement, every glance between us was full of unspoken words and hidden feelings. I found him on the porch, sitting with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked lost in thought, and even when I approached, he didn't notice me right away. I sat down quietly beside him, searching for the right words, but none came. We sat in silence, but it was a burdened silence, as though words could never fully express everything we felt. Finally, he turned to me and said that we needed to talk. His voice was heavy, as if each word took effort. "Do you remember when I said that sometimes it's better not to know the truth?" he began, looking down at the ground. "I didn't expect things to turn out this way, but now I have to tell you. We can't keep going like this." His words caught me off guard. I felt my heart clench, something inside me breaking. We were sitting side by side, yet there was now a chasm between us that felt impossible to cross. "Jake, what do you mean?" I barely managed to get the words out. He looked at me with pain in his eyes but kept speaking. I didn't want to ruin what we had, but... He paused, struggling to continue. "We can't just ignore what happened. We can't go back to how things were as if nothing changed." I stared at him, trying to absorb the meaning of his words. We both knew this wasn't just a fleeting kiss. It was something much more. But it wasn't what we had expected, wasn't what was meant to happen. We both understood that the feelings between us were too strong to ignore, yet too complicated to fully embrace. "You're right," Jake said. "This wasn't just a mistake. But we can't be together. I don't want to lose your friendship, but we need to keep our distance. It's simpler for both of us. Otherwise, we'll end up destroying everything around us without even understanding how." His words felt like a sentence, and I felt something inside me fall apart. He was right. We both knew it. These feelings were too powerful to simply forget, but too dangerous to allow them to grow. We tried to bring normalcy back, but each glance, each gesture between us only grew more strained. I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. Words felt meaningless because everything I felt defied explanation. I knew this moment would change everything between us, but I had no idea how to endure it. Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lake. His shoulders were tense, as if even he couldn't believe what was happening. I stood too, moving toward the door, but before leaving, I glanced back at him. "You're right," I said, my own heart breaking with those words. "We have to leave this behind." He didn't respond, only nodded silently, and in that moment I realized everything between us had already changed. We both knew it, and even if we tried to return to what we once had, we would never be able to. The day of departure had arrived, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had stretched on like the final scene of a movie I'd never be able to rewatch. We were ready to leave, but silence and awkwardness hung in the air, like an invisible barrier between us and what should have been a simple farewell. We went through the motions, bustling, packing, but something felt off. I glanced at Jake, who was also busy with preparations, and every look we exchanged was laden with everything left unsaid. We shared only a few brief phrases, trying to maintain a semblance of normality, but it wasn't working. The pauses grew longer, and words felt increasingly unnecessary. We both knew that we could never go back to what we had before everything changed. And maybe we both understood that even if we could, it wouldn't be what we wanted. When everything was packed and my parents were finally ready to leave, I stepped outside. The house no longer felt as warm as it did when we arrived. A feeling washed over me, a cold wind of realization that this place was no longer mine. I walked down to the lake, standing at the shore and looking at the water, which now seemed like an endless mirror reflecting my thoughts and emotions. The surface was calm, but I sensed hidden storms below, ones I couldn't comprehend but felt deeply within me. Then I noticed someone approaching. It was Jake. He walked slowly, as if he knew this was the last time. We stood by the lake, not saying a word. He came closer, and I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't fear or pain. It was a look that held more than any words could express. "You know," he said softly, "I'm going to miss these days." His words sounded like a farewell, like something that didn't need to be said but was impossible to leave unspoken. He didn't say anything extra, didn't try to apologize or explain, but there was a sadness in his voice that held me captive. I couldn't respond. All I could do was stand beside him, feeling everything we once had slip away between us. There was no kiss or loud goodbye. No words could capture what we felt. It was a simple silence, full of an aching emptiness. At some point, I realized that everything that had happened between us wasn't meant to become part of our lives but to remain part of our memories. A void that would stay with us. When he turned to walk back toward the house, I stayed behind. I felt the air around me growing thicker, heavier. We would both carry this emptiness with us, this unresolved ache. And maybe this emptiness was something we both could never overcome. I stood by the lake for a long time, listening to the quiet rustling of the wind in the leaves, thinking that everything that happened would remain an unanswered mystery, overshadowing all our expectations and hopes. And even though we were now going in separate directions, that mystery would stay inside us, and it would never become reality.